Bigger brakes are better, right? I want to cover 3 things that all of us, mostly me, get wrong about braking. And this video shows you why those things are not just, oh, hey, it's wrong, but why are they wrong and what can we do to make them better? And thanks to eBay Motors, we're capable of not only making a video this polished, but also finding the parts we need to make the car better. My buddy pulled up in his Audi RS whatever with massive carbon brakes, and the first thing I thought was that thing must stop on a dime. Wrong. Well, at least the cause and effect of that sort of thinking is wrong. Just because it's much bigger doesn't necessarily mean it stops it faster. Case in point. Putting Audi brakes on that little Insight would not have decreased that stopping distance. In short, big brakes do not decrease stopping distance. This is something we all it makes sense, but we all have to come to terms with. Many of you know this is my C5 Z06, and one of the cool things about car manufacturers is that they tend to have upgraded parts later on in the same generation or potentially useful parts from a new generation. Now in the case of the C5 Corvette though, both the stock car and later cars and the Z06 upgraded model all have the same brakes. But the cool part actually happens when you go to the next generation. Now, the next generation isn't always a guaranteed bolt-on, but let's be honest, the car manufacturers want to save money, so they don't want to re-engineer things. They got something working, and so they often will leave the core the same, if not extremely similar. So this wheel hub is the almost exact same one used on the later generation. And in fact, the spindle, this part back here where the brakes bolt onto, is very similar. Now there are upgrades and all that, but the bolting position is identical to the point that the C6 has some tasty upgrades for this car. And thanks to eBay, I'm able to do something like this. As you guys may know, eBay Motors has been a big help in all of the weird stuff that I do. For example, the front differential for the 4-rotor, it's out of a BMW. Where did I get that? eBay Motors. The power steering pump, out of a Volvo. eBay Motors. It's a phenomenal resource for testing things like this and finding some really good bolt-on upgrades. And in fact, when you go to a salvage yard, you don't have the sort of buying protection, you don't have the clear list of shipping times, of return policies, like you do on eBay. What we did is we bought a set of C6 Corvette Z06 front and rear brake rotors and calipers. Right off the bat, you can tell, assumingly, bigger is better. In many ways that is true, but let's quantify why. Bigger rotors, smaller rotors. Bigger rotor means more weight. Weight is a function of mass. The mass helps with thermal issues. It's easier to maintain a normalized temperature. You're spreading that energy out over a larger thing. There's a lot of really unprofessional ways of showcasing this, but this is about as professional as you can get. I have a temperature gauge, a little baby thing right there, telling us how hot it is at that tip. It's like an EGT almost. It's so hot outside, but you can see it's pretty accurate. So what we're gonna do is show off the theory of thermal mass. He is going to put the same amount of time, which is roughly the same amount of energy, from this heat into this chunk of aluminum. So you see that little guy like this. Touching it after this is not gonna be advisable, so we have this. 1, 2, 3, 10. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and put it in that same spot, and we're leveling out about 126 degrees. It's definitely warm, like feel it, wouldn't pick it up, but you can, yeah. So we're gonna go ahead and do the exact same thing with a larger chunk of metal. 1, 2. And I even jumped on that faster than on the previous one.
Yeah.
This is expected. This isn't like magical news, but you can see the larger chunk still has the same amount of energy that was applied to both, but because it's spread out, this whole piece overall experiences less heat. So if you had an oil line right here, you can already see where this is going. If the oil line was right here, you're only gonna see 106 degrees. And if the oil line was right here, 130, with the same amount of energy applied to both. And not just the rotor, but also the pistons. On the stock car, the front calipers have 2 pistons. They're actually rather large size, so they're phenomenal. The stock Z06, on the other hand, has 6 pistons, 3 on one side and 3 on the other side. And those are slightly smaller, but there's so many more of them that the surface area of this is much more than the surface area of that. And the same thing occurs on the rears as well. This is the rear, and you can see that's really beefy too. There are 4 pistons on this rear versus a single piston on the stock car. Now, is that adequate? We are going to show you 2 very critical concepts, very simply, that this entire video builds on heavily. What I'm gonna have Isaiah do is put his little pinky fingers out, go ahead and put them on the piece of metal. And you can see that even if he tries pushing really hard, from my point of view, I'm able to move that very easily, even though he's a far distance away. Now, watch how much worse it gets if I'm really close. The small amount of surface area of his pinkies really close to me is just a joke. The small amount of surface area further away, it becomes a little bit harder for me overdo his force that he's putting on this. Now, go ahead and put your hands in a clap, yep. And so we're gonna go ahead, same thing here. Obviously, you can see the basic concept here is that I can still slide that out, but that surface area that he's applying to there is making it much more difficult for me. If we do it this way,
I'm not even trying.
yeah, the combination of both the distance and the surface area is the winning combo. But another small detail to that, if you put your pinkies back on here and I move that out of the way, that generates a lot of heat instantly on his fingertips. The heat is localized right there. So you can see how heat's gonna start playing a factor into the 2 basic concepts of braking. Well, on the stock car it is. The ratio and everything is great. So if you took the stock car's front surface area of all of these pistons, add that surface area up, and have it a ratio to the single rear piston, you get about a 1.6 ratio. So the front calipers have 1.6 times the area of the rears. On the C606 on this kit, adding up all 6 of these and compare it to all 4 of these, and you're at about 1.8. So it's a very similar number. It's simple wins like this that make this sort of stuff about upgrading cars so much fun. First of all, same bolt pattern, which you would assume that, but you can't always assume. That is the C606 rotor on a C5. For most of our car guys, that makes sense, but there's so many times where that does not add up. You gotta count your blessings here. But that's it. It's not hitting anything. That's major positive. But the heartbreaker possibility is over here. Now that that rotor is in its centered place, we better hope that not only do these bolts align, but they have the right offset. And so there's 1, and there is 2. And so the important part is, look at this. The rotor is centered here to here. Now the pistons will make up for some of that distance, recenter it. That's the nice part about having 2 sets of pistons, is that they'll just find home and clamp in. But that's about as bolt on as you can get right there. Are you guys ready for the heartbreak? It's a positive heartbreak, but there is only so much rotor that you can fit inside of a wheel. Unfortunately, close, right? But we are touching right there. It's so close it hurts. The tire is now wedged because of the brake caliper. That would be amazing if that worked. And you compare that, so look at this shot from the other side to this side, and you can see that's amazing, but this just isn't meant to be. This is a 17-inch wheel. We have to move up to 18. That's what we wanted, but you have to make sure that you get the most brake for the tire you're intending. Many of the C5 Corvettes came staggered, 17s in the front, 18s in the rear, and so we're gonna go ahead and take the rear wheel and test it on the front. Now we're looking for the caliper clearance. We're back to nice, tight, flush caliper. So we could run these in the front. Actually, that'll work out perfectly.
Anytime you get brake fluid over the car, on the floor, or even like this, something that's painted, brake fluid is very, very, very corrosive. So just get some soap and some water that's mixed together and just spray it around just to neutralize it and wipe it off, so that way it's nice and clean and you don't hurt yourself.
Okay, if bigger rotors, brakes, calipers, surface area doesn't decrease stopping distance, why does a stock car feel so spongy? Especially some of our older cars like the old RX-7, even this Corvette 20 years old, why are the brakes spongy? Well, it's not this, it's what's behind it. I have had my heart broken time and time again because of this. These rubber lines are adequate and barely just that. These lines are carrying up to 2,000, if you do your brakes wrong, up to 2,000 PSI, maybe on race applications even higher, but on stock brakes, you're often seeing 700 to 1,000 PSI. That's a very common number. You upgrade these to stainless steel coated brakes. It's not fluid going through the stainless steel. There's still a rubber or rubber type of hose on the inside. The stainless steel is preventing it from bulging, because if you press the brakes and 2,000 PSI, for example, goes through this hose and it's like, oh, I'm about to push the piston in, well, this can swell well below 2,000 PSI, and so you get a bulge here, and so your brakes actually aren't making it to the brake caliper. It's bulging and swelling in this area. So this stainless steel braid really prevents the internal hose from expanding, and you get much more crisp, direct response from start to finish. Because, you know, the general rule of thumb is that air is compressible, and our favorite way of doing that is with boost. 25 PSI liquids, especially brake fluids and whatnot, they themselves aren't meant to be compressed. On a microscopic level they are, but for the most part you can assume that it doesn't compress. So when you put X amount of force in on the brake pedal, you should roughly be seeing X amount of force in at the caliper. That's what's robbing a lot of your brake response on a stock car.
When you're re-putting things together, they come OEM with Loctite on them. So before you assemble everything again, clean everything off, reapply Loctite. This is important because they get really hot. You don't want anything like that backing out. So clean your bolts, put on Loctite, reinstall everything, make sure everything's tight. For like piston expander tool, so this works. They're all pushed out. Every time I did it, I squirted some brake fluid onto a little rag right here. All good for Rob now.
So with this being the front left brake caliper, one of the biggest bummers about this that we didn't realize ahead of time is because they're so small, they look like you can slap them in there like bullets in a magazine, but that is not the case. You have to have it all apart to do it like a traditional one, because there's those retaining rings right there. To the rule, and for those of you guys going, yeah, Rob, but yes, this section is for you. You can run this big of front brake and that small of rear brake. You have to solve the problem at the master cylinders. The pressure ratio, the bore size, all of that is completely different. So you've kind of created more work for yourself in one way, but if this was your intended result, if you're gonna go with a small brake pad back here to run a 15-inch tire, which is common for drag racing, there's still a ratio, and the way to solve it is up at the front of the vehicles. One of the best parts of doing videos like this is the research I enjoy doing behind the scenes, and sometimes I find out more information halfway through filming the video. So if you hear something that sounds a little off, I want to correct it, and that's the whole point of learning and growing. So the thing I made the mistake on is when you have pistons opposing each other. See, I'm a rotary guy, I don't know pistons. And when you have pistons opposing each other, the force, one's pushing on the other, it divides by half, and it equals out to the same as a floating caliper, one piston. So when you see people measuring the surface area of pistons on both sides, they only focus on one side because it's like, redundant is not the right word, but it's like times 2 divided by 2. The same thing as one side with 3 is the same pressure and clamping force as 2 sides with 6. And that said though, the ratios are still very much the same ratio front to rear. So what I want to tell you though, is that when you upgrade just the front of the vehicle, and you look at the surface area of all of the pistons on this, it's actually very close to the previous thing. So it wouldn't really be an upgrade, would it? It's the same surface area, but that's where the distance aspect comes in. And let me show you the calculations. It's not a quick, oh, I did this math in my head type of thing. You know, doing tons of numbers, but adding the distance as a function of this you end up finding out that swapping from the old front to the new front increased front clamping force, torque, by 10%. It went from 4,200 to 4,800. And so it does make a difference that you'd have 10% more braking in the front, given the same pedal force and the same PSI coming to all the brakes. That is really interesting. Now the rears are even more interesting. So on the stock car, existing stock car, this ratio, as I said before, was a little bit more 50-50. On the C6Z06, the ratio is more front bias. Where does that come into play? Well, if you had the same wheels as the stock car did back in 2002, you are now putting too much braking force on the front of the car. But tire technology has improved, and people generally, when they're racing these type of cars, want a much bigger tire in the front, and that allows you for more braking force, which means you can have that increased the rotor and caliper are too.
Thank you.
This really illustrates a beautiful point. This is much larger. As we now know, that means it's got more thermal mass, all those other benefits that come with it. But you now have reduced the number of rear wheel sizes you're capable of using. So the drag racers aren't going to look at this and go, hey, that's great. So it shows, though, that the benefit you gain really starts choosing the path of what you want to do with the car. The clamping force for this is less than the previous one, just based on the piston sizes and even with the larger disc and everything like that. But it is your choice. Now, this will be better on the track, absolutely, but it won't help you drag racing. Crazier you go, the more extreme you dive in, the more the paths start to diverge. Like some old Robert Frost poem, took the path less traveled, and that seems to be the case right now. Something I want to point out is this video really is not going to go into detail about surface area, brake glazing, or airflow. Obviously, getting air ducting into this is highly critical for helping get rid of the heat, just like a radiator, but we're mostly focused on the surface area. When you have tons of fins on things, it's easier to have heat transfer and all of that. But again, that's not really the scope of this video. That's more advanced. We are finally aligning this car. This car was crashed, frame bent back into shape. The guys from the frame shop said, okay, well here, we'll give you roughly the correct alignment, but not steering alignment, not camber, no nothing. And so the car's always been slightly off in every way possible, and we're finally putting some settings to make this thing handle great on the street and the track. So what I did out of curiosity was I maxed out the lower control arms, which are the points that you adjust this car from. And so it kicked the rear and the bottom of the tire out, causing this insane camber gain that you don't see normally on Corvettes. This is about a little over 2 degrees. We'll be scaling it back a little bit, but it does allow the wider tire, which this will end up being a 285, to fit inside the fender well as it travels up and down. So incredible that the rears fit on the fronts. And we just had a little pizza party to celebrate the fact that we finally have a quality alignment. I'm not even joking, look at this. Pizza. What I wanted to tell you guys is what our alignment settings are, so that way everybody can argue it. And that's the best part about weird settings that are custom to you. But in general, when you're half track, half street, straight line stuff, we're going for about 1.7 degrees of camber, negative, so it's tilted in. And then the caster was to make sure the wheel sits in the right spot. Caster is kind of like a shopping cart stat, you know, like the wheels will straighten themselves out a bit. I don't have a specific goal with caster, but that's kind of a byproduct of the way you adjust these. We did not toe in the fronts. They're basically neutral. Some people will go wider, some people will toe them in, high speed stuff. Your choice is there, but when it's out like this, the car will hunt when it hits things in the road. I don't want that either. Now in the rears, we're doing something a little different than we normally do. Normally we run no camber, so the rears are flat, or we'll run just a little bit of whatever to try to make sure that when the car squats that it's flat. Now in this case, because it's also going to be a track car, we're going middle of the road and going with 1 degree of camber in the rear. And so we also added a little bit of toe just for that nice turning and straight line stuff, kind of middle of the road. So we'll see how those settings work. Of course, we're going to take this to the track, but straight line stuff, street stuff. So we're going to see just how that all works all together. Fortune Auto sent us 12K springs. We're upgrading the 8K springs in the rear of the car because the insane angle of the stock Corvette. The stock Corvette's almost a 50-degree angle. And so your spring rate, as you go up and down, massively decreases the actual rated spring rate. So it doesn't travel as much, therefore it uses less pounds per inch essentially. So oversimplified, but we've got the 12K in here, so this should give us a rate similar to 10K in the front. So we'll have very close front to rear. The rears are a little bit softer, and thankfully, because of Fortune Auto's ability to go real wide range with their clickies, we can start here, firm it way up for the track, and hopefully keep it soft for street launching and maintain that like half-mile race type feel, just a softer street ride. So this gives us a spring rate ratio, or hertz, or whatever you want to say, of about 1.7, 1.6, where it used to be closer to 1.3. So it's not an aero-based race car, so we're not going for 2 or more. We'll see how this treats us. Now, check out what Isaiah's doing as well. And it's mostly because of this right here.
At the top of our coilover is your adjustment for softer or harder shocks. At the top of that is this little box. So to adjust it, unfortunately, I have to take the coilover off each time to even do like one click adjustment or any adjustments at all. And that's just the way the Corvette is built. There's really no way to put that adjustment anywhere else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill a hole through the fiberglass that's in there, because it's not metal, it's actually fiberglass, into the trunk, so that way I can stick my little fingers in there and adjust it whenever I need to. I have to pull up the carpet, but I think that's a lot easier than taking the whole suspension apart just to change one notch. That's how thin the trunk is to the outside. This is also why Corvettes are badass and why they weigh a lot less. Instead of using metal and bonder, they actually fiberglass pieces.
So check this out. We're gonna come from the backside here. You guys should probably be able to see this. 12K, 8K. Watch what happens when I push as neutrally as possible in the middle.
More.
It goes.
Jeez. That's insane.
Both Fortune Auto shocks are set to absolutely minimum. So you can see just the spring rate differences, how much that, when they say oscillation, you can see that this is a little bit more firm. It's not the firmness as much as how it reacts to the weight of the car. So this one's lazy boy, this one's a little bit more firm, but it's still, if you ignore that side for a second, look at how much, like, I still have tons of room and movement. That's a softer setup still. That is now both springs at 12K. And conventional knowledge, 12K is a very firm spring. It ends up being over 600, 550 pounds per inch. So you'd think that this would be super stiff. It is not. She's still got that lazy boy feel to it.
This is that baby making.
Yeah, it's the right motion for the ocean. Thing to Fortune Auto shocks is that we can now take the dampers and turn them up and really stiffen it up. You always want to do that as the second step. You don't want to mess with the damper first and then mess with your spring rate. So we now know that this is the softest of soft, and then we can go, as firm as we want. Right now we are at 2 clicks from the most firm version of these shocks, and it's where you want to be. But the problem is we currently have a range, tons of soft range, and then at the last second it really gets more firm, and that's the spring rate. Now the biggest problem I have with this setup is what we expect to use it for. And if we do big willow, so willow springs, big track, and turn 2 is this big long right sweeping turn. That's where that's where I killed. Actually, that's where I starved the RX-8 to death. Just like the 4-rotor at Grid Life, if you have soft springs but turn up your dampers, as you turn, the initial turn will be firm, but then the car can start sagging because the damper's allowing the fluid to move. You got the G-force pulling you to the outside. You eventually squat and sink to that side on longer turns. So we're gonna go ahead and switch these from 12s to 14s. This is super exciting to me. The geeky math all pans out. Isaiah and I have been slaving away getting this all set up for like a nice clean setup, and I think we have it. We swapped to the 14K springs, which sounded way too firm. They aren't. We'll check this out. This is currently 15 clicks of damping. Underneath that is perfect for drag racing, perfect for all the soft launching and absorbing all of that. Really happy with that. And in fact, when you watch this get more damping, you'll actually see that this tire, which is about 18 PSI, ends up becoming your first spring, which when you're really doing all your math and your big boy level, like that RVCA full-blown level racing, the tire itself is a spring. And it actually interacts with the spring. So watch what happens when we dampen these all to max.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you can see that it's the tire that's doing the majority of the springing. That means that we have tons of adjustability, and I really believe with this spring rate, which for those guys wondering what the end up hertz is, it's about 1.8 front and rear. The rear bottom half is smooth, that lazy boy thing I was telling you about, and then the top half is going to be all dialing it in for the track. So I'm very excited for this, and of course the ride's going to be just as best as it can be. Suspension feels so much better, and the brakes, we have a lot of bedding to do, and my ABS solution errors out every so often, but that's just the beginning of how this car is going to run.